Welcome, listeners, to the latest episode of the AdQuick Advertising podcast, a podcast that explores the intersection of marketing, technology, the business world, culture, all of these things that you guys care about. Today, I'm super excited to have Carol Roth as our guest. She is a television personality, entrepreneur. She's an author. She's an investor. She's an all-around really cool and smart person. I've enjoyed reading her thoughts online for many years. And despite not having that in person, I would consider her one of my internet friends that I would do whatever she asked for. So I'm excited that she's here. Welcome to the podcast, Carol.
I'm so excited to be with both of you. And Adam, as I said, I won't call us old friends because obviously we're both very young and vibrant, but long time internet friends. So it's great to be able to chat in this forum.
Yeah. And I know Chris has enjoyed your content as well. So I think we're all like mutual admiration of you, Carol.
Oh, well, it's so nice. So nice.
Definitely been mainlining it over the last few weeks.
So this has been a big few weeks for you, Carol. One of the excuses to have you on the podcast, not that we need one, is you just published a book, which I actually tried to order and it was sold out. So I had to get the digital version. I'm an old and I actually like the printed version, so I will hunt one down. But you're already really well known in the business world for having poignant takes. And I think it's interesting to, I love to see people in the business community have thoughtful takedowns of, not even just takedowns, critiques of what sort of broader government and policy people are doing. So I think that this book ticks a lot of boxes for people in the business world. And I think this is really particularly interesting for advertisers who are most of the people listening to this podcast, because they're sort of having a lot of their creative and their tactics sort of dictated by maybe not necessarily just the brand, other people in the room as well. And so before we get into anything else though, why now? Why did you write this book? Why was now the time? What was sort of the straw that broke the back that this was the next topic for you?
Okay, so fair disclosure here. I'm often approached to write things, and usually when somebody approaches me to write things, I say, no, I don't want to write that, but maybe there's something else I want to write. So I have already done 2 other books previous to this, and HarperCollins came to me and said, oh, we want you to do something that's in the economic realm. And I went, okay, well, I don't like the things that you're talking about, but let that simmer. And as somebody who is a recovering investment banker who spends a lot of time advocating for average Americans and wealth creation opportunities, very entrenched in the business community, particularly small business, but I've also been an advisor to the largest businesses on the planet. There were lots of different things that were all coming at me at one time. And it's everything from the debasement of the US dollar to sort of this emerging, somewhat formal but informal social credit system, Fed policy that's transferred a ton of wealth, big tech renting our lives back to us as a subscription or a service, Wall Street competing with people for homes, all these kind of disparate things, but they all stood for barriers to free enterprise and to wealth creation and property rights. So all of a sudden I was, trying to go what's the through line? Like, how do I connect all of these things? And I was walking and all of a sudden it hit me like a lightning bolt. I remembered a meme that had gone around on social media. You will own nothing. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy, coming out of the World Economic Forum, which in and of itself was a weird kind of thing. It's a prediction that they came up with from their global future councils, their top prediction of 8 for 2030. And this is an organization that is littered with the business elite. It really started from a business standpoint, and then it has political leaders. And so when you have all these people going, there's going to be no private property, as somebody who goes, wait a second, wealth comes from ownership. You have to own assets that have the ability to retain value and increase in value. That just sort of hit me as a possibility to tie it together. and also to be, kind of thought provoking. When you see a title that says "You will own nothing," it makes you stop and think, and gets everybody's attention. And as marketers and advertisers, we know that that's kind of the first piece of the puzzle. That if you want to have messaging, you have to get somebody's attention. And so that's kind of how that all pulled together.
Yeah, the concept of I've seen that meme as well, and I think it's so great that someone is you who wrote a book with that title. It's like we couldn't have a better just voice and for that book. It seems weird to me as an advertiser. Owning things is a very American concept, and so when you see the globalist narrative of you will own nothing, it strikes me that some people, like in America at least, like try to push that aside and are like, well, it's never going to make it to America. It's like conspiratorial. But then if you look at what's actually happening around us with all the trends you said and others, tech companies, BlackRock, etc., it's not really a conspiracy theory. It's just sort of the trend of capitalism. So it strikes me as this shouldn't be a political thing. It should almost be like yeah, let the European experiment be the European experiment, but that shouldn't necessarily come overseas. We didn't elect those people.
It's very true. And unfortunately, we have a lot of people in the US who have gone over, and some of them do it knowingly and some of them do it unknowingly, but carry these ideas back and forth in a way that always sounds good. I mean, it always seems like it's a really good idea to start with. But there are a lot of ideas that go bad. And I talk about this model in the book where you can start with something that we all agree is, oh, this is a really good intention. And then this profiteer class gets involved and it bastardizes it. And then all of a sudden we're dealing with the bad outcomes. And so, you may say, oh, well, how great and convenient might it be to not own things? But what really struck me about the phrase, and again, with advertisers thinking about communication and branding and language, I think it's so important to dissect some of these words. The concept that the prediction was you'll own nothing. It wasn't will own nothing. It wasn't the person making the prediction saying I own nothing. It was you'll own nothing. So that in and of itself, speaks to this sort of different class situation that's going on that I think is very destructive to the fabric of America and to free opportunity, and has not been a good thing throughout history when you have people feeling like they have different potential opportunities. Obviously, we can't predict equality of outcomes, but we want to have that equality of opportunity. So the idea of you'll own nothing, but I'm going to be great and I'm going to own all these things, kind of stood out to me. And then the second part, the you'll be happy, is very strange to me as well, because they're trying to almost get buy-in, psychological buy-in, to say, wouldn't it be nice for you to have this carefree life where you don't have ownership, and someone else will take care of everything, something which again is not particularly American in its spirit. And the idea is that if you get the buy-in on this and people go along with this willingly, that's a much better outcome than if it is having to force that upon people. And unfortunately, with the levels of debt that a lot of college students have, and what's going on with housing and so on and so forth, there are a lot of young people who don't believe that they're going to be able to attain the American dream. They have been sort of groomed on technology that teaches them to be in these digital worlds where they don't really have ownership over a lot of things. And so, whether it's out of, hey, this is, my lifestyle, or maybe it's a psychological front going, well, I'm not going to be able to attain this, so I'm just going to pretend I don't want this. There are people, particularly young people, who are going along with I don't really want the ownership narrative. And that's very scary, because people throughout history who did not own things, they, not only didn't generate wealth, but they were unfree, they were unhappy, and in many cases they starved or lost their lives. So it's a huge turnaround, like you said, in the mentality of what free enterprise has historically meant here.
Yeah. And so I want to ask, along with that, in the advertising world, a lot of advertisers are now having to do things which help their company get a higher ESG score. And I'm curious, how does that fit in with the WEF narrative? Because I kind of see a lot of overlap personally, but I want to hear your thoughts on that.
So we'll dial it back a little to just give you the history and again some language around this because I think it's helpful and then in sort of framing what's happening today. So the WEF was founded by a man named Klaus Schwab, who was an engineer. He still runs it today. By the way, draws the salary that's about equivalent of $1 million a year. So definitely doing pretty well with it. And it was started as the European Management Forum. And at the same time that he started that, he came out with a book that embraced the concept of stakeholderism or stakeholder capitalism that he was making up. And he's been pushing this. He's very persistent for over 50 years. And I distinguish the concept of stakeholder from a true shareholder. A shareholder is somebody who takes risk, whether it's their blood, sweat, and tears, and they get a stake or options in a company, or they risk their capital and they take on some investment. They've put some skin in the game. And because of that, they are a shareholder, they are a true stakeholder. And that means that their opinions are important because they are sharing in the outcomes. Klaus Schwab, since the beginning, with this idea of a stakeholder, said, I don't want to take any risk. I don't want to have any skin in the game, but I still want to mold what companies are doing and what the outcomes are. So this is something that really started there. And through the years and through the associations, particularly with groups like the United Nations, the concepts of stakeholders, people who don't have risk, people who are outside of the company trying to bully their way in and make impacts on companies to shape what they want outside of a political process, outside of having to put up capital or risk, has been alive and well. And they have changed the name. And I go through in the book sort of the history of this many, many times. And, has come out most recently in this moniker called ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and corporate governance issues. Now, outside of like those specific names, we don't really know what those mean and how those are ranked and whatnot, because they're meant to be vague. They're meant to be malleable because the whims of the people who are sort of pushing this change. And we've seen this with things like, wars in the Ukraine. Before the war in Ukraine, you had something like weapons that had, negative ESG, but as soon as there was a Russia invasion of Ukraine, then all of a sudden, well, maybe weapons should have good ESG scores. So it is this kind of thing that moves around that makes it very, very difficult for anyone to kind of get their head wrapped around. Not to mention that, who gave some group of people the authority to dictate what anybody should be doing, let alone corporations outside of its shareholders, its actual stakeholders. So I consider ESG, and I know this is very different than what's going on in a lot of corporations, but I consider it to be a corporate social credit score. I consider it to be a bullying tactic, very mafia-esque, because in many cases it uses other people's money, in many cases retirees and pensioners, to dictate what these companies should be doing. And, that has become a big issue because one of the largest money managers in the world, BlackRock, has been a huge purveyor of this. They're part of the World Economic Forum. They are a partner to them. They're very well entrenched, and they have used that as a forum to be able to bring it back. Now, some of that may be just for fees and profiteering purposes, but some of it may be to shape agendas. And we've seen videos of Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, with people like Andrew Ross Sorkin, talking about having to force or shape behaviors. So it's not like I'm just, putting my own spin on this. We're letting their own words stand for themselves and trying to take the conspiracy element out of this. So when you have the largest asset manager in the world who controls depending on the day, $9 to $10 trillion in assets under management, and tends to be one of the largest shareholders in a majority of the companies on Wall Street, along with two other really big firms. They have a lot of power to say, we're not going to vote for management. We're not going to vote for directors who don't go along with what we think should be happening. And again, what they think should be happening is not the fiduciary responsibility to do what's best for the company. It's to shape an agenda. And I don't think a lot of people in corporations who are touting ESG, which sounds, again, in principle, like a nice, good thing, understand how truly nefarious this is and how wrong it can go. And we've seen several companies, whether you agree or not with their decisions, but really get hammered for going down, some of these weird roads. And you're going, why would a company put themselves in that position? Well, probably because their management was worried, that they would get either fired from that position or they would be blackballed from industry and not be able to get another position because of the people who control the money. And so I think that having more of an awareness of that is important, because I've talked to people who run ESG, to CEOs of companies. Many of these are publicly traded companies. They've never heard of the World Economic Forum. They don't know where ESG comes from. They don't know the background. So they've really become these useful idiots that are entrenching it into corporate culture and perhaps profiteering from it and not understanding the true long-term damage that could be causing, and then creating all kinds of issues for their organization, because then you create this sort of gamification. You're trying to get a higher ESG score and you do one thing, but by doing that one thing, you lose something else because the point system keeps moving all over the place, and you never really get ahead. And the only thing you're doing is distracting from your core business, your mission, your employees, your shareholders. And I think that we've seen that to be very detrimental for businesses.
So, Carol, in your research, in your analyses, do you find that this is a phenomenon that is particularly happens in publicly traded companies? Is this undue influence take place in privately held companies? Can you kind of shed some light on your findings?
So it depends on the company and the industry and how they're financed. Certainly, the number one group of companies that this impacts are publicly traded companies, because a group called the Business Roundtable, which is the CEOs of most of the biggest publicly traded companies in this country, signed on to these kinds of principles, probably at the behest of their cronies like Larry Fink that were pushing it many years ago. And so it's sort of become entrenched, and we've had the current administration put in these ESG and sustainability czars into weird places like the Securities and Exchange Commission and whatnot. So it really has become an issue, although we are starting to see pushback. We noticed in the time we're taping this, just this week, that McDonald's has quietly removed some of the ESG language from its website, and some others are starting to downplay it. And even Larry Fink himself said, I don't really want to use this word anymore because it's become politicized, not realizing that it's not the word that we're concerned about, it's the behaviors that come with that word that we're concerned about. So clearly the publicly traded companies have been in a much worse position because they deal with the capital allocation in the public markets. The private markets, you have a lot more choices, or if you're a smaller business and you're self-funded, then you don't have to worry about that as much. Although it could impact you getting a loan or whatnot, depending on what industry you're in. So that goes to the second piece, is that there are certain industries, as you can imagine, that have been very much impacted in this. Fossil fuels, clearly it has been a top target, but perhaps if you're around something else that is a hot button issue, firearms and ammunition and those kinds of things, that you're seeing purveyors and groups that have the capital going, we don't want to necessarily do this because it could impact our business social credit, which again, in a free market, shouldn't be happening.
For the longest time, many folks, myself included, kind of conflated ESG with maybe let's frame it as a thoughtful approach to dealing with climate change, sustainability, so on and so
Sure.
forth. But going back to the changing scoring mechanisms or criteria, I remember Elon was tweeting that the fossil fuel companies have higher ESG scores than Tesla, which is obviously doing remarkable things on the climate change front. What are some of the scoring components that these companies are kind of influenced on?
We don't know. They change all the time. I mean,
I think that's wild.
that is the problem. We've seen, okay, it's very bad, for you to have a private jet or for you to fly because, that's using up a lot of fuel. Oh, except for if you're Amazon delivering packages. Oh, except if you're like these super wealthy people that really need their private jets because it's important because, they're better than you and they need to talk about these things. So we find that the components are ever shifting and changing. Nuclear is bad, which makes no sense in the climate discussion anyway. But oh no, if it's powered by this over this period of time and this, now it's okay because we're having these problems with energy in Europe, because of the Russia invasion of Ukraine and all the sanctions that come out of that. So we don't really know what the scoring system is. And then I found this one dashboard, which I talk about in the book, where you can go in and you could type a company and there's like sort of like they do their own behind the scenes calculation, and then there's like these special issues. And my favorite one that I found was Home Depot. And Home Depot had, by the way, a really good business social credit ESG score from these purveyors, but they had a black mark. And when you clicked the black mark, it said Trump associated. And I went, well, how is Home Depot Trump associated? I mean, like the ridiculousness of that being a black mark to begin with, but like they're not even Trump associated. And then you go through and you realize that one of the founders, who is no longer active in the business, he's not running the business, but has been out of it probably for 10 or 20 years, at one point had made a donation to Trump. And it's kind of like, really? Like that's going to be your ding. You go back to Elon Musk, I talk about this in the book as well, is that he was actually dropped from, I believe it was the S&P ESG index, as soon as he said that he was going to buy Twitter, or whatever it's called these days. I'm still going to call it Twitter. So that's my protest. I still call it the Sears Tower in Chicago. So this is my protest. It's still going to be Twitter. But when he wanted to buy that, and I'm not saying that he is a bastion of, promoting free speech, but that was basically, his play. And people were worried, oh, free speech means more speech that we don't like and we can't control. So because of that, we are going to take Tesla out. And the reason they gave was because of, the CEO behaviors. And as he said, like they left some of these fossil fuel companies back in the index. Well, they took Tesla out. So we really don't know what it means. And again, a lot of the issues, we want to be good stewards of the planet. We want to have, interesting, diverse perspectives and experiences. We found that that's, good for companies, but it has to be done in an authentic way. It can't be done in a check the box way or somebody else pushing the narrative way. And we found over time, like if you treat your customers and your employees poorly, or if you do things that are really bad, like people are going to figure that out and they're going to put pressure on you to change that. We don't need this unelected group of people giving out scores, creating huge profit infrastructure, distracting from the main purpose of the business in order to have those good outcomes. And, we've found, those companies, to date have not performed as well. There have been many funds that say that they're ESG that have gotten fines because they don't seem like they're any different than just any other big cap or tech fund or whatnot. And so that, there's just a lot of tainting when you try to go in and engineer these outcomes from a centrally planned perspective.
It seems especially odd to me that after the previous financial crisis, where it was very clear just wholesale believing a rating score from an agency should be a way to invest was a good idea. It seems odd to be back at this point where we have, professional investors taking their cues from, some nebulous ratings agency that, isn't transparent and frankly shouldn't be, it seems like a lazy way to conduct diligence. Right.
It definitely is. And it's like, who elected these people? Who said that these were the right criteria? I mean, if you are a fund manager, you're an active manager, that's your job. Your job is to come up with a proprietary set of criteria. Otherwise, we could just invest in exchange traded funds that mimic, groups of companies, or just invest in the broader market. But if you're going to add value, you're the one that should be doing the research and saying these are the kinds of things that I think are going to produce good outcomes for the shareholders. And if there's something that they do that's bad, you can bring that up and shed a light on it in your research report. Like, that's your job. You don't need some other disinterested party who's like, yeah, and I want, this to happen today. And so now this is bad and this is good. I mean, it's very much consistent with what the Communist Party is doing in China through their social credit system. And, what's interesting about that evolution is that it started with businesses first and then went down to individuals from there, because they know that if, they can control individual or businesses and what happens with them at that scale, then individuals will go, well, if you can go after Jack Ma and Alibaba, you're really going to be able to come after me. And so that evolution, really started at the business level there. This should not be the kind of thing that is dictating how business is done in any free society.
So one of the things that I'd love to do really quick is to just dive into maybe a specific example of, how this influence has, steered either businesses or countries. There's a couple examples I have in mind, but I'd love for you to kind of share some insight into how some of these applications have gone wrong.
Okay, so I hate talking about this, but because it's an advertising podcast, I'm going to talk about it anyway. We can't not talk about Bud Light, right, if we're going to talk about this. And so my own perspective, just to be clear, is that I'm an ally to the trans and LGBTQ community. I have trans family members. I have trans friends. Dylan Mulvaney, I have no problem with her living the life that she wants to live, but certainly a hot button issue, right? And that's just the world that we're living in. And not understanding your customer base and who is buying the product, and then trying to wade into something that's, again, outside of your core business, especially when you had like the best branding on the planet. You had Clydesdale horses, you had Americana, like it stood for something. And then to do sort of a stunt that now pulls you and exposes you into a culture war thing, that it doesn't matter what side you're on, it's just not a good business decision. It's not something that should happen. I have never, in my history of being involved in business, as an investment banker, as a market commentator, as a business watcher, I have never seen a marketing destruction of value ever like I've seen for this. And the sort of tangential effects, the wave effects, because it's not just that core brand, it's all of their small business distributors and everybody else who are the real stakeholders of the business. As I said, they're the ones who have taken the risk. They're the shareholders. They're the partners. They're the ones that have skin in the game. And so to just put that all aside and to wade into something that, what was the potential upside? You can be an ally in different ways, but like, why did you need to do that? And I come back to the notion of the fear that if you don't seem like you're on the right side of whatever the narrative issues are, that there are concerns from people in C-level and other high-level positions that they are going to be punished personally, either at that company or in future endeavors, or perhaps both. And so I think that, it's sort of a mind your own business. If you're in business, mind your own business. If it's something that's authentic to your brand, we've seen many brands do this incredibly well. The Patagonias of the world that are very aligned with green initiatives, and it's authentic to them and it makes sense to them and to their customers. Like if that's who you are, I work for a company that's in the toy space. They were the very first people to do ethnically accurate fashion dolls, and they have tons of representation. That makes sense. That's what their brand is about. But if you are a big mass brand, or if you're catering to a certain customer, like focus on your business and don't get involved in this, giant mess that's going on, because it's a no-win situation on either side. I don't know if do you guys have thoughts on that?
So I agree with everything you said. We had a creative director come on previously, and he echoed all of the things you just said, and he added one other interesting input, and that's a lot of marketing and ad orgs have succumbed to a culture of safetyism. So whereas back in the day you'd have like the Don Draper-esque guy who would, shoot down everything else and be like, this is the idea, here's the vision we're going to make, whether,
right.
A man or woman creative director. And that has sort of been, that role doesn't exist so much anymore. Everything has become this designed by committee culture of safetyism. And the problem with that is you need that, creative visionary in the room to tell the story, or else it's going to get watered down. And with the Bud Light thing, what an opportunity for them to do a message of inclusivity. So imagine this piece of creative that they could have had with, all sorts of different Americans, including a trans person, including, someone on a farm, including someone in an office, all enjoying Bud Light. That would have gone over wonderfully. Everyone would have loved it. A few kooky people on the far, on the far left or far right might not have, but who cares? And the problem is, I've said this before, it's not even political. I think it's almost cringe. I think if you do something cringeworthy in the age of social, it's going to get amplified and you're going to get dragged for it. And yeah, people are going to make political decisions, but ultimately, with the influencer marketing tactic that they chose, they let their brand be in the hands of someone who is not a advertising or marketing professional, is an online person, and it could be anyone that if your brand gives that control to, it doesn't matter who they are, you're taking a huge risk for almost no upside. You mentioned Bud Light is a beloved 100-year-old American brand. It's like they're I don't understand why that bet would be in place if not for someone thinking that this is something they had to do for their career, or they felt like they were being an ally. And I think they're the opposite of being an ally. I think they're harming, the whole situation by not actually bringing anything forward.
I was going to say, I don't actually think that they were being an ally. And again, this is, I'm not out here to criticize one person, but I think that in terms of the trans community, while Dylan Mulvaney perhaps has a very large following, I think a lot of people don't find Dylan to be perhaps very authentic, right? Lots of, animation, but not sort of an authentic person, and not somebody who's had a trans experience for a very long period of time. This is a very new thing. This isn't somebody who's been living with this, as many of my friends have, for decades. And so it seemed very much like a stunt, not an authentic piece. And I think that's kind of what you were getting at, which I think is important. The other thing, which is an idea for advertisers that, we may sort of joke around about, but like, it would not be a bad idea for you all to have a panel that you cultivate from Twitter personalities to run things by and go, okay, what did we miss here? Because I think a lot of times when you're surrounded by the same people and you have a certain perspective and you're in a corporation and there's the corporate jargon, it's that insulated bubble. And we see that, in tech, we see that in politics, we see that in finance, and it's in the corporate sphere as well. And, you have a group of 10 people with various different perspectives on Twitter, and they're going to find all of the things that are wrong. And it would be a really good return on investment, whether it's from, new products to new creative to what did we just put out here that you guys are going to tear us a new one? And then you can decide, that people are critical, and sometimes you go, okay, well, that's not really a big deal. but something like this would have been entirely avoided if you would just take the time to, have sort of the social, the court of public opinion on your payroll. I think that's a huge business opportunity for somebody.
Conversely,
yeah.
I
Go ahead,
would
Chris.
argue on top of that is that, I think now marketers are doing quite a poor job at studying the history of advertising and how products have been messaged and conveyed, because they could have easily just went and remixed that Coca-Cola commercial from way
Right,
back when.
exactly.
That is the focal point of the, season finale of Mad Men, right?
Right.
Like, he goes and finds his Zen, and that's how he creates the concept. And I think, that plus the committee piece would have, alleviated a lot of their pain.
I think there just sorry, Adam, one quick thing that comes up to mind is that, there used to be that saying that there's no such thing as bad publicity. That has completely gone out the window with social media. That may have been the case when people weren't connected in the way that they were, and where there wasn't something that I call ROE, return on ego, from making big deals out of things that aren't big deals. And so I think that has to be a new lens in the digital age, that just because people are talking about you, even, it used to be, even if it was slightly negative, it was still like, I'm in the conversation. Like now that is not the case. And you have to be aware of that.
Yeah, I think one thing Carol said, which was interesting, is she's asking with this book and a lot of her writing, she wants people to ask second and third order questions about the world, especially business leaders. Why are we doing this, and not just agree to it. And I think one frustration I have with marketers is Carol also wanted marketers to do a panel of people who are tuned into the culture. And one thing I've argued for a long time is, yeah, a panel is great, but why do you not know? Like, if you're in a marketing role, why are you not plugged into the zeitgeist of the internet? Like why are you spending so little time involved, and you're in a leadership role? It just doesn't make sense to me, as someone who I've been at, FANG type companies in the past as a consultant and full time, and it always kind of made me it was one of like the less exciting parts of the business world when I had leaders who like didn't really pay attention. It was maybe they were just so focused on, I guess, their teams and internal, but it's not really that much work to know what's going on in the world. So I'm asking people, if you are in a marketing leadership role, to spend time understanding, what's happening in the zeitgeist. And I think it could save you a lot of trouble, and it can, at the very worst, it will help you delight your customers better.
Yeah. Yes. And so, following a podcast like this, following people like all of us on social that are going to highlight these things for you, and just having, a couple of things will give you most of the trends. However, the circle of knowledge is so big that I would say they should be up on the 80, but they're going to miss the 20. And there are things like, there was some fashion brand that put out like something, and they had like a logo that looked like the Holocaust star. And there was another fashion brand that did something that were like, and it's like, sometimes you just can't see it. You know what I mean? Like, if you're in the middle of it, like, you're just not going to see it. You need a range of people who aren't seeing, they're seeing the forest, and they're seeing the trees, and they're not like kind of mixing. Sometimes you're just too close to it, or there's something like super random. Like, I could name some designers who've been involved in like, crazy campaigns. Like, you're not going to know that like this group of people, if you're doing a collab with this particular designer, that, oh, the gossip sites have said these really bad things, and you're potentially exposing yourself because they did a photo shoot that kind of seemed like pedophilia. You know what I mean? Like, you're just not going to know those kinds of things. So there is that like crazy elite level of knowledge where you need the wide range of perspectives, because like, even us that are plugged in all the time are still going to miss some of these things. And also sometimes you're just too close to it.
Totally. So getting back to, I want to talk more about the WF, because that's your whole book, and there's obviously brand implications. And so I'm curious, because to like you, me, and Chris, like we like bold companies that take risks, that build new categories, that, disrupt the status quo and sort of, move us forward with, into everyone having more abundance, cooler tech, more efficiency, all these great things that capitalism does. I'm curious though, like in a WEF world, like what is the role of brand? Like, are we allowed, do they want us to do big, bold, creative, or do they want us to, everything has to fit within like established norms? Like, is it at odds with how markets and capitalism work? Because it seems to me like a lot of what they want is like weirdly the opposite of what I was taught in marketing school and what I was taught about the business world, of how you kind of take a fun cowboy approach to things and, take these stodgy bureaucracies and make them more efficient, right? Like the parts of capitalism that are good.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The book talks about so many different groups, from the biggest of big tech to some big businesses to some of these NGOs to the government to the Fed. And I think that the thing that you see in common with these organizations that get really big and that want more power and try to consolidate things is that you get this central planning, whether it's sort of government or business oriented. And that stands apart from sort of decentralization. It's, not a lot of freedom. It's a handful of people, making decisions on behalf of the masses versus, all different kinds of people who are doing things freely and very transparently. So I think the idea of being a maverick and having freedom stands at odds with all of these bigger entities. And I think as big entities are worried about power instead of going, rogue, so to speak, and opening up themselves up to freedom and letting them stand on their own merits and not being worried about losing control, because what it is that you're offering to the world is value in and of itself, and that's what got you to that point. There's this sort of chokehold that we have on individuality and freedom and agency. And so to me, that stands at odds with advertisers and marketers' jobs, with the creative approach to any problem solving, to new goods and services, and frankly to human flourishing, right? The things that make our lives better and more interesting and propel us forward. When I look at some of these decisions and some of these suggestions, it's almost like you see things rolling backwards. Like you almost like see a dark ages ahead instead of, something that's, full of beautiful technicolor and all of these cool things. When I think of my predictions for the world, right, like we're all thinking of the Jetsons and we want Rosie the robot and flying cars and beautiful technicolor. They're predicting we're not going to own anything. Like, look, the sets of predictions for the future and that vision of the future is so completely different. And I do think that's the problem with too big of a scale, not having competition, which I don't view as capitalism. That's what capitalism is supposed to break up. It's supposed to have competition, and we're supposed to have any sort of antitrust issues have those reset so that we have this wonderful playing field, because that's what's brought us this really unique experience that we've been able to live through. I mean, the period that we've all lived through and just before us in our lives has been the most remarkable, amazing time in history. And we should be pushing more of that. And it seems like the opposite is really happening. And I do think it is just parallel with choking off that individuality and that freedom, and with it, the creativity that comes with it.
As you spoke, another parallel dawned on me, and I'm curious if you have thoughts on this. We're in the tech sector, and there's sort of a group in the tech sector that has come out as sort of, we call them D-cells, and they're sort of the group that's afraid of AI. Like I'm being completely direct. They think that AI, that chatbots, it's literally a computer that talks. They think the chatbots are literally going to take over the universe and turn us all into paper clips. And it seems like the same kind of existential doomerism as like, the climate doomerism, which there's obviously climate change, but it's not like, today, right? Like we have time on these things. And I'm curious, do you have thoughts on what the sort of decels is that a parallel to what the WEF is thinking? Because they also want centralized control of AI versus a open source, everyone gets an AI in their pocket, just like everyone has a cell phone in their pocket, right?
So I'm probably somewhere in the middle on this. I'm like always like in the middle of everything. Because I think there's always probably some nuggets you can pull from both sides. What I worry about, and one of the things I talk about in the book, is that you have these tech companies that have in many ways become these de facto governments, right? They stand over things like speech and our wealth creation opportunities, but our rights are not protected specific to the digital sphere. And when you think of the scale of some of these companies, their market caps, and I know it's not an apples to apples comparison, but again, just to give us some scope, their market caps are larger than almost every developed nation on the planet. They have more users than almost every country on the planet, some cases than every country on the planet. They have, these fortified balance sheets, they're in, all of these critical infrastructure places. And then you have, now AI coming out that is learning on other people's, sort of proprietary knowledge, my proprietary writing, your voice, the way that you look, other people's output. And so I am very concerned about our individual rights in the digital space. And so what I would like to see is, just that protected. If you're going to have something that's an AI, and you can't like just train on my stuff and me without my consent and my compensation. And I don't think that's been thought through. And again, that it's nascent, so of course it's not going to be everything sort of just happens, and then you have to kind of like make your way through it. But I think it's important to not let it get too far down the path without thinking about the role that our individuality and our individual rights play in that, because it is important for us to retain sort of what makes us human, to make that protected. I mean, just imagine a future where you've got Elon Musk's Neuralink implanted into your head, and it's got all of your thoughts. And something happens to you, and you want a new body, and you got to take the thoughts out and plug it into a new body, but you got to store that data somewhere in the cloud and through a company. Like who owns your thoughts? Can they put your thoughts in somebody else's mind? Can they give it to it's just like when you start really thinking about it, there are a lot of like really existential questions that relate to humanism. So I think that the people on the sort of decentralization side have a lot of very important things we need to think about. And I think the people who are creating new technologies have a lot of important things to think about. And if we just protect the things that we're supposed to protect, and we had everybody voluntarily signing up for this, because we know that the people who make laws and stuff like that aren't going to get it right, but that should be something that we should just say, hey, we all agree, these are our natural rights and they should be protected in the digital sphere. And as a good ethical company, this is what I'm going to follow. I mean, that's what should be done all of the time. But of course that never happens, because the biggest companies benefit from regulatory capture or non-regulation either way. So like, why would they agree to that voluntarily? You would hope they'd want to do it out of the goodness of their hearts for the children. But human nature is human nature. And as technology evolves, and we theoretically should be better people, human nature is very, very constant. And that's why we have this history rhyming scenario.
Yeah, so like as technologists, we typically start with the customer first. We understand their needs, what their pain points are, and we create products around them. And I'd like to, use maybe like the last segment of our pod here to kind of explore what are the second and third order effects of consolidation and centralization of these large companies. Is it going to be a type of scenario in which, like Soviet area Cold War, where you have everything you need, but everything kind of sucks, since
Yeah.
like the competition kind of goes away? I'd love to kind of get your take on what the implications are for upstarts and small businesses. Obviously, not obvious to you, Carol, but our marketplace services, 1,500 media owners that are typically small to medium-sized businesses. What does that mean in the long term if this type of thinking actually takes mainstream and they actually get what they want by 2030?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be a really bad outcome for all of our lives. We would lose wealth creation opportunities, we would lose richness, and it would be basically a dictatorial state. I mean, you can pick your favorite ism. I'm not here to define fascism versus communism versus socialism. It's all central planning. And we know, throughout history, there's never been a time where centrally planned outcomes have been better than those of the free market at scale over, reasonable periods of time. You can certainly always say, oh, well, here's a kibbutz in Israel and they did this, but it's like, okay, that's 20 people. That doesn't work for billions of people around the world. So I think we need to keep that in mind. And I think that's why we do need to protect our rights. And part of that protection is, if companies are getting too big and their scope is too big, that either they're treated as infrastructure or they're asked to, open up and not be anti-competitive. It's okay. It makes sense. There's going to only be so many social media platforms, but if those are town square, our speech should be protected. People shouldn't be kicked off, but also there should be open access so that technologists can create other cool things to add on to the experience. And, it's okay if multiple entities benefit, but like you said, you don't just want a handful of people to be dictating what that experience ends up being, particularly when there's so many rich opportunities out there. And I do think it's concerning that you have just a handful of companies that are gatekeepers to so many different things and also rent extractors from so many different things. As I said, I'm a free market capitalist, but like you have to have rules of the game to have, this freedom. And there's been a lot of tilting the scale in favor of these companies. They've benefited from government policy or lack thereof, or monetary policy, or, all kinds of things. And it really has put them at an unfair, non-free market advantage. And I don't think that any of us benefit in the long term without having more of that competition being able to come in. And, somebody's going to be listening to this and go, creative destruction. Oh, remember MySpace? And, that went away and now we have this, but it's still like, it's not necessarily like that it's going to be the same handful of companies all the time, but it's still a handful of companies. Like it's much harder for, smaller businesses to be able to come in and to be part of this ecosystem. I know the metaverse isn't quite as hot as it was, perhaps 6 or 9 months ago, but I would imagine something like that, comes to mind again. And maybe there's another run at that. And that was a piece that I did in the book as well, where it's like, okay, it's clear that when you're in the metaverse, they're going to do brand partnerships with, Nike for your avatar's shoes. But like, do they get an exclusive on that category, or can I come in as, an independent person and also have an opportunity for that? If I am participating as an individual in a metaverse or a digital world, and I make an investment and I buy my digital property, like, can I resell it? Can I take it with me somewhere else? Like, what do I own? Or again, are you just renting me my life as a subscription or a service over and over again? And I think that these are important questions to ask, that when we're sometimes caught up in the, oh, cool technology, oh, this, whatever, we kind of forget where we came from and how all of this prosperity happened. And the prosperity happened because more people had access to property. That property was expanded to things like businesses and intellectual property via technology. And that was protected, with the acknowledgement of our property rights. And so as we move forward digitally, I think it's really important to have people be thinking about these things and making sure that the digital right protections of individuals is part of this process. It will make a richer outcome for everybody. And that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to just have a handful of people win. It's not a game. It's a abundance mentality. It's a rising tide lifts all boats. And, I think that's absent from a lot of the conversation.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap. Carol, you've given a lot of food for thought for our listeners. I know there's a certain sect of our listeners who love this. There's a certain sect who you probably went a little bit above their pay grade, but it's good to get everyone thinking, even if you're just an ad creative person. And I do think there is a power of all of us in what we say and what we do online to help shape the future. I don't think anyone is powerless yet against the WEF or anyone else. So. Carol, where can we find and connect with you online?
Yes, so I am Carol J.S. Roth across most platforms. I am mostly on Twitter, still calling it that. Although you may have to turn on notifications for me because I'm getting about a tenth of the impressions at most that I got a year ago, which was about a third of the impressions I got a couple of years ago. So the throttling issue has been one that would be, again, if you brought more people into the fold, so probably something you would address and solve, but maybe that will happen. And of course, I'm going to make fun of you, Adam, because when you own nothing, you have to get a physical copy of the book because you have to start owning things. You have to start with that behavior. And while certainly you don't have to own everything in your life, when you think about key things, key assets, those things that really create ownership. And, obviously we're in a digital age where words can be changed and things can go back and people can shift them. It's nice to have a record of that in the physical world too. So.
Well, awesome. Thank you, Carol, for joining today.
Thank you.
For people watching this on YouTube, I'm doing the YouTuber thing again. Please like, comment, subscribe. That's the best Mr. Beast impression you're ever going to get from me. Thank you. And we will see you all next week.